Welcome everyone. My name is Howard Kornfeld, and I'm really honored that the Olympic has allowed us to make this presentation tonight. And we're going to be talking about getting to the roots of the addictive process in the nuclear madness of our current world. But I want to introduce, before we dive into that, I want to introduce Nathan Rose, who's an artist, musician, and writer, and he's going to sing a Leonard Cohen song that may give us a little bit of light. Okay. And we'll try to have the words up on the screen.
Yeah, so this is by Leonard Cohen. It's called Anthem. The birds they sang at the break of day start again. I heard them say, don't dwell on what has passed away or what is yet to be. Yeah, the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. So ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. We asked for signs, and the signs were sent. The birth betrayed, and the marriage spent. Yet the widowhood of every government, the signs are for all to see. I can't run no more with that lawless crowd, while the killers in high places sing their prayers aloud. But they've summoned a thundercloud. They're gonna hear from me. So ring the bell that still can ring. Forget the perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. You can add up the parts, but you don't have the sum. You can strike up a march on your little broken drum, and every heart to love will come. But like a refugee, that still can ring. Forget that perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offerings, 'cause there's a there's cracks in everything, and that's how the light gets in. That's how the light gets in.
Thank you, Nathan. I think for me, the theme of this song is what we're here about. And I've been cultivating this optimism, actually, in light of everything, in spite of everything going on in the world. But it is important to recognize the darkness, if we're going to let the light get in. And one of the people I sent a message to about this program tonight is someone who a number of you know, Jim Fadiman. And Jim wrote back a little note to me to support what we were doing tonight. He said, "God knows we need what you are asking us to remember and not lose track of the deep darkness with all of the little darknesses nipping at our heels." So one of my beliefs is that not looking at the nuclear situation and the devastation, of course, that can happen, is something that we've all gotten used to, because we can't look at it all the time if we're going to live our lives. But a conscious way of looking at it, and maybe this concept of addiction is just a new way of looking at it that might give us some hope, because as we know, almost everyone here has dealt with addiction in friends, family, or oneself. And some of you have treated addiction, and one knows how hopeless it seems, in the midst of that addiction, until there is this transformation. And sometimes that's a hitting bottom and a shift of thinking, a shift of epistemology. And if we're going to use some terms that Gregory Bateson used. So I gave a version of this talk about 6 weeks ago in Nagasaki, the day after my wife and I toured the bomb site. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. How's that? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. And there's a little feedback, but so we visited the bomb site, and there's a peace park there where many nations have contributed beautiful sculptures, and then there's that's off to the side of the actual site. And then the actual site is a plaza, and there's a significant sculpture statue there, and it's of a woman, although it could be a Buddha or it could be a man, but that person is holding a limp child. And it's a very moving place. And so I was in Nagasaki for what's called the 24th World Congress of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And I'll tell you a little more about that organization in a moment. But the name of this talk formally is Breaking the Cycle, and Roger was kind enough to help create that name, Breaking the Cycle, Undoing the Addictive Roots of Nuclear Madness. And I was inspired by Gregory Bateson and some of my connections with the world of people who have carried on his work. And he was an anthropologist, a social scientist, a cyberneticist. And I really wanted, I'll tell you a little more about how he viewed this concept of addiction. And I was blessed to meet Roger this last year, Roger Walsh, who will come after me. And my friend Robert Jesse, who's been a leader in the startup of psychedelic research at Hopkins, and Michael Pollan wrote about him among other people. But Bob, when he found out I was interested in kind of exploring the threat of nuclear war and how it relates to everything going on, he said, "You need to talk to Roger Walsh, or you need to look at his book." So I did. But then I was fortunate enough to meet Roger, and I'll say a little more about him a little later in the talk. So we could have the next slide. So I first got involved in this issue after the 3 Mile Island nuclear power accident in 1979. And somehow I was sort of ready to receive that sort of inspiration. And I credit many people like Helen Caldecott, Dan Ellsberg, who I really felt inspired me. And I was part of an organization, and the time was right in terms of there was a concern around the country that was developing. And I think it's the kind of concern that can develop now. It's starting to develop now, but we can nurture that and be guided a little bit by what happened in the past. So we had a small chapter called Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is sort of a US version of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. And the national group got a grant from the one of the Rockefeller foundations, says, put on some conferences on nuclear war. So we did. And I happened to be the program director of this one and publicized it. And this conference was the second of 6 conferences, but somehow this conference hit some kind of chord, and the time was right. We held it in the War Memorial Theater. We got 200 physicians and like 800 people, and then we got some media. The media actually paid attention to us for a change. And as you see, the Wall Street Journal wrote the conference up, and the San Francisco Chronicle. And then there was a newspaper in the East Bay called the Independent Gazette at the time, and they actually put a big headline, Nuclear Aftermath, you know. So again, the time is different, the media is different, the media ecosystem is different, but this can break through the barrier. So next slide. So because I was the program director there, I was relatively young, but quickly around that time, the physicians took some real leadership, and a group of physicians at Harvard in particular, and UCSF, and around the country, deans of medical schools. There was a real concern about the Carter administration had moved into the Reagan administration, and there was a nucleus of people in very powerful positions in the government that were saying, let's just prepare to fight a limited nuclear war. Look, we're stronger than Russia. We could take it. So it got a lot of attention, and a cardiologist from Boston, Bernard Lown, who actually was a little famous because he invented the cardio version of the heart. He had been working with a prominent cardiologist in Russia who happened to be Brezhnev's cardiologist and who was also a very innovative cardiologist. So they got together and this group started. There was the first Congress in 1981, and the Nobel Peace Prize was given to this organization in 1985. So next slide. So a fellow named Philip Goudamy, who is an anthropologist himself and very active in the Bateson kind of circles, wrote a little summary of Bateson's views on addiction. And it turns out, as many of you know, he was a very productive thinker and writer, but he didn't really write too much about addiction until the last 5 years of his life. And then he didn't even write about it. By that time, he was kind of just teaching at Esalen Institute and other places. But he would keep bringing up over and over again, we need to understand addiction much better than we do. And so next slide. And so in Bateson's sort of last book that he wrote on his own, there was a subsequent book he wrote with his older daughter, the daughter of Margaret Mead. But he felt that we needed a study of addiction, and it's somehow related to fundamental biological phenomena like adaptation and like extinction. And he said ecology is maybe the beginning, but we're still far from telling us how to get out of a nuclear armaments race. So next slide. Just a little bit about Bateson that some of you may not know. Bateson's was part of the so-called English scientific aristocracy, but I think they did some good with their prominence. His grandfather, William Henry Bateson, was actually one of the leaders of Cambridge. And this was in the middle of the 1800s. And there was a decision, there was a movement to make the Cambridge independent from the Church of England, which is a logical thing at that time. Science was growing. And so his father kind of led a bloodless revolution and succeeded with others to create an independent scientific or secular institution. And he was a celibate priest, as the teachers were at that time, but he married one of the leaders of the suffrage movement in England, and that's Anna Aiken, so Gregory Bateson's grandmother. So then his father was William Bateson, who was a zoologist and a botanist, and he was actually the first person to use the term genetics. And next slide. Around the turn of the century, he helped publicize some new research, some new discoveries and replication of Gregor Mendel's work. So he named his son Gregory, But at that time, advocating for Gregor Mendel's work was somewhat, against the grain, and he had a fight, he had a fight to have the recognition of Mendel's work because it didn't exactly fit in with some of Darwin's theories that were considered the orthodoxy. And so Bateson was sort of bred in this idea of questioning the established thinking of the time. So next slide. So that's a picture of Gregory, and then his first wife was Margaret Mead, and it was a very dynamic duo. Next slide. And the two of them had, Margaret Mead and Gregory had a daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, who really has done some wonderful work, and she died a few years ago. But Nora Bateson, Gregory's youngest child and younger daughter, is alive and is the founder of the International Bateson Institute, and has done some great work. But next slide now. So Gregory was part of a group of people who were really looking at things deeply, and just a year or two after the atomic bomb was dropped, he dove in to write about sort of an anthropological look at the nuclear arms race and the patterns of an armaments race. This was before even the sort of the field of cybernetics, which he became very associated with and famous for, had emerged. So next slide. Just a side note, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which most of you know was probably the closest we've come to a nuclear war, and apparently it was due to a submarine commander of a Soviet Union that was on a sub that was failing, and the sub was not doing well, but he got a message to launch missiles, to the United States, but he had the wherewithal to say, let's just wait, because he probably knew that some negotiations were going on also. So there's a couple instances like that, a little more on the Soviet side, as it turns out, than the American, at least the prominent stories of people who've held back after commands to launch missiles. But what happened is Gregory was studying animal communications at the time, and he wrote to one of the national security advisors of JFK, the president, who he knew, and in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was trying to communicate what he knew about animal communication and aggression within animals, and how they can show signals to each other even in the middle of aggression that they want to make peace, or they want to back off from aggression. So he wrote this letter, and this Philip Goudamy just analyzed that letter and wrote a whole book about this. So it's just another intersection that Bateson had with the nuclear arms race. But next slide. So what happened is Bateson was appointed as a regent of the University of California around that time, around the early 1980s, and Stuart Brand, who published the Whole Earth catalog, began to publicize Bateson's work, and Bateson started to, he was not an overtly political person, but he decided to take a political stand and ask the regents to consider severing its ties from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the Los Alamos Lab, said a university shouldn't be in the business of creating these weapons. So next slide. Stuart Brand then subsequently published the Coevolution Quarterly, and then he started to talk about addiction. This was the period of time when he was talking more about addiction, and he said, this is a multi-level addiction with at least 5 interlocking hierarchic levels, you know, and then he's referred to this adaptation and acclimation and addiction and pathology of some sequence, you know, and the idea is that species could be viewed as getting into double binds and having an addiction context and becoming extinct, and maybe we don't want as a species to be going in that direction, although we are, but we can pull it back. So next slide. So Jerry Brown, a couple years after Bateson's death, he was not governor at the time. He was in between his 2 governors. He wrote a very thought-provoking article, Nuclear Addiction, a Response, where this is a Jesuit journal, philosophy journal, and he dove into his Catholic theology past, because he was studying to be a priest at one point, and he highlighted some of Bateson's addiction comments. The next slide. And this is just a quote from his article that you know, it seems like an alcoholic, you know, is not feeling good, and it's the logical thing to take a drink. You feel better, you know, and it improves the situation. Just like militaries feel threatened by the weapons of the other side. So it's the logical thing to build another weapon, to build another type of weapon. But at a different level, that fix becomes inducing an instability at a different logical level. So next slide. So Bateson went on, towards the end of his creative writing career, at least his academic career, he published in this, it was a prominent psychiatry journal, and actually his was the lead article in 1971, and he analyzed, what he was trying to do is he decided that he was involved in cybernetics and systems theory, and he thought, well, maybe we have something to offer the treatment of alcoholism. Okay, so he then went on to study Alcoholics Anonymous, and he dove in, and what he realized is that the Alcoholics Anonymous had such a powerful, useful process that he said, well, they could teach us ecologists something about how to shift epistemology, how to shift mindset. And next slide. And I like this. This is the last few sentences of the article. And basically that the non-alcohol world has many lessons which it can derive from the ways of AA. And it is doubtful whether a species having both advanced technology and this strange way of looking, because he defines this alcohol mentality of where the self is isolated, you know, that we have this illusion in the West, or we're taught to think we're isolated, but we're a part of a bigger system. So the first step of AA, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. He would rephrase that as we admitted that the system of the self and alcohol is much more powerful than the self, you know, and then came to believe that a power greater could restore sanity. Next slide. So I want to just throw in a little bit of a segue to one of the reasons why I think there is a lot more hope than meets the eye in terms of our current situation. This particular book came out a year and a half ago, and its subtitle, as you see, focuses on Margaret Mead, but it focuses quite a bit on Gregory Bateson also, and the troubled birth of psychedelic science. Well, as we all know, there was a lot of troubling and, if not evil, practices by the military, by the government in the early psychedelic period. But there was also, but the core of it was not. The core of it was some sort of advance in human evolution. And these quotes from book reviews give a little sense of that. How could human society, how can we improve human society? Can we, as anthropologists, can we help a sick society? There was, even before the sickness that we have now, it was evident even in the interwar period. And there was an optimism that psychedelics were part of, that things could change in the world, partly because of these new insights from these drugs. Next slide. So I was very lucky, and I ended up hanging out at Esalen Institute a bit when I moved here from Chicago, and I met a lot of different people, including some of the doctors and psychiatrists who relaunched some of the legal psychedelic research. And a couple people in this room were at this conference, John Mendelsohn and David Presti. But right at that moment in 1994, there was just a very few research projects that had been FDA approved, and it seemed like, how would we ever get widespread interest in psychedelics? So this is one of the things we talked about at Esalen for 5 days, and yet here we are. It is 30 years later. It took a little bit of time, but we now know, we now have experienced a renaissance in this area. So just like there's a renaissance in psychedelics, I believe there could be a renaissance in thinking about these nuclear issues, thinking about how addiction ties into it. Next slide. This is Roger's book, Staying Alive, which he's going to give a better explanation of. And I'll just say a couple things before passing the torch to Roger. This period since the 1940s from now, I mean, this is both the nuclear age. This was the era of Alcoholics Anonymous and the modern addiction medicine movement. And this is also the era of psychedelics. So all these things are happening at the same time. So it's not a coincidence, let's say, that Bill W., the founder of AA, actually, the inspirational episode that led to AA was a psychedelic experience in the Towns Hospital in Manhattan in the 1930s, because the doctors at that time were giving belladonna alkaloids to help people get through alcohol withdrawal. And we know today that it's not the right drug to give, but they didn't, they thought, well, just give something to help them through that. But it's likely that the white light experience that Bill W. had was mediated by what would now be considered a psychedelic experience. And then in the 50s, he, being inspired by Aldous Huxley and some other important figures, Betty Eisner, who came to our conference at Esalen. He experienced LSD and was very moved by that could be something that could help alcoholics. So in ending, I'll say that there's this huge movement of alcohol recovery, and it's a very powerful movement, and it's very moving to be, because I'm in the field of addiction medicine and pain medicine. It's very moving to be in this field because we see people go from, you know, the most hopeless, painful states and their families into beautiful recoveries. You know, we see that. And then we have this whole psychedelic movement. Same thing. I mean, yes, there's dark sides, there's problems, but there's so many positive transformations happening. So what I'm curious about is, could this large movement of addiction recovery merge in a certain way, which is already merging, with this large movement of psychedelic, you know, transformation and awakening and renaissance? Could be a very, very powerful cultural phenomenon, even though it doesn't have, quote, power in terms of the kind of power, you know, that maybe exists in certain billionaires and military industrial complex. But we can change the consciousness, and Roger said that 40 years ago in the book, and I yield the floor to him.
Well, thank you very much, Howard. And thank you so much for working on this issue for as long as you have. I'm glad to have been able to hear this because I knew you'd been a pioneer. I just didn't realize how continuously you'd been working on this. And it really is, I think, a threat that is underestimated. Of course, minds and brains habituate. We've been exposed to the idea of a nuclear war or nuclear crisis for decades now. And it's really hard for multiple reasons, I think, for us to realize just how horrific that would be. One measure that I find really powerful is the recollection that the total amount of bombs, weapons that were used in World War II amounted to 2 million tons of TNT. That's one medium-sized nuclear warhead these days. And we've got tens of thousands of them floating around. So this would end civilization. I mean, it's easy to forget this. Just that everything we know would go in a day. And it's extraordinary that the nuclear strategy, as you commented on the title, is MAD, mutual assured destruction. And it is a kind of collective insanity. And I want to set this in a larger context, and that is that we have this sword of Damocles hanging over our heads. But at this stage, it's tragically only one of a number of crises. We can think of the ecological issues, we can think of pollution, we can think of population, starvation, etc. There are multiple issues that we as a species are facing that have the potential for wiping us out, or at least decimating or degrading dramatically our civilization. And collectively, they're now known as the meta-crisis, the sum total of issues that we face, plus, and that's the kind of polycrisis, but then the meta-crisis also takes into account the fact that the psychological and cultural roots that feed into this. Because our technological power is so enormous at this stage that the state of the world now reflects the state of our minds. Think about it. The state of the world is literally now so shaped by human behavior that we've entered into the Anthropocene, a new geologic era, in which the very nature of of the planet is shaped by human behavior, which means it's an expression of our individual and collective psychologies. And the extraordinary implication of that for understanding the nuclear crisis and the other aspects of the meta crisis is that if, in fact, the world is an expression of our individual and collective psyches, that its pathologies are an expression of our individual and collective psychological immaturities and pathologies. And what we call our global crises, including the nuclear crisis, are actually symptoms. That our global problems are actually global symptoms, symptoms of our individual and collective psychological dysfunctions and the addictions which Howard was emphasizing, as well as the immaturities, the neuroses, the pathologies, the dysfunctional systems, the pathological reinforcers, etc. All of these feeding into create this incredible mess that we now face, which literally threatens our civilization and even potentially our survival as a species. So we have become like the sorcerer's apprentice with enormous power and very little wisdom. And we have effectively become nuclear giants and technological wizards while remaining ethical infants and wisdom dwarfs. And that imbalance may well destroy us. So the questions that come up for all of us, and I assume everyone here is wrestling with these questions, is the first question comes up is, hell, what can I do? What can I as a little individual do? And it's very interesting. You start thinking about these huge crises. Initial response is, well, they should do this or they should do that. But if you think deeply enough, you realize that in terms of actual impact, it always comes back to what can I do? And so the question, what can I do, is the one that we face. And it's really important to know that this is a particular kind of question, because there are two major kinds of questions. There are knowledge questions and there are wisdom questions. Knowledge questions have a one-time answer. You look out there, is it raining? Take a look out the window, you have your answer. That's the end of the question. But wisdom questions are more like Zen koans. Every time you ask them, they have the potential for taking you deeper into the question, deeper into yourself, and deeper into life. So the question, what can I do in the face of the nuclear crisis and the individual and collective psychopathologies and spiritual pathologies at their root, is a wisdom question. And so there's no expectation there should be an immediate one-time answer like, oh, of course, I should do this. These are rather this is a question to be reflected on deeply over time. But there's a deeper question, and that's the question of, what am I called to do? Because each of us in this room, online, effectively we're living pretty privileged lives, and each of us are graced with an enormous number of opportunities and connections and possibilities and skills. So the question is how best to use those. What really calls me? Because clearly we're most likely to be effective and empowered and continue acting if we're doing something we're impassioned about. So the second koan is, what am I drawn to? What of all the things that I could do, what really pulls me? What aspect of suffering touches me most? What skill do I really want to use? How do I want to apply myself? And then there's a third question, which is, what's the most strategic thing I can do? Of all the possibilities, what has most leverage? How can I, to use Buckminster Fuller's term, trim tab most effectively? That is, trim tab is the little rudder at the end of the rudder on a plane or a boat. And if you turn, those huge rudders are far too hard to turn by hydraulics alone, but if you just turn the trim tab one way, the whole rudder moves the other way and the whole plane or ship moves in that way. So trim tabbing, which was Buckminster Fuller's idea, And Bucky Fuller's gravestone has his epitaph, "Call me Trim Tab." And he was a magnificent Trim Tab. 1,083 patents. That guy changed the world. So the question, how can I Trim Tab most effectively? And then for those of us who really want to take it on as a mission, there's a still deeper question. It's a lifelong question. How can I live my life so as to be an optimal instrument of service? Now we're really playing the Buckminster Fuller game, because that was Bucky Fuller's game. How much? He was suicidal in his 20s. He'd lost a child. He was bankrupt. He contemplated suicide, and he said he had an epiphany. What would make life worth living? He decided what would make life worth living would be finding out how much good can one person do. That's what kept him alive, and he changed the world. So that's our question. What can we do? So I want to suggest that those are koans that are worth sitting with. I also want to suggest there are a number of principles which are really helpful to keep in mind as we contemplate working not only in quotation marks, with the global crises/symptoms, but also with their underlying psychological spiritual roots, the addictions, the pathologies, the neuroses, the needs, etc., that fuel these, the fears, the greed, etc. And the first one is that all civilizations face recurrent threats. The great historian Arnold Toynbee, in his survey of world history, recognized that, successful civilizations go through multiple crises, and the ones that succeed go through a process of what he called challenge and response. That is, in the face of a crisis, a successful civilization's a small, so-called, what he called creative minority emerges. A creative minority which recognizes the crisis, is moved to respond, and comes up with solutions, and then inspires the sleeping majority to adopt them. So there's this four-part process. And if you're listening to this, if you're part of this evening, you're part of the creative minority, or one of the creative minorities. So it's really useful to realize that, nuclear weapons are a novel threat, but they're part of a larger pattern. And we know the pattern by which civilizations respond effectively. So that's the first principle. Another principle is that if we're going to alert people to just how horrendous this situation is, we better be aware of how people respond to stress. And unfortunately, under stress, people tend to regress psychologically, get more egocentric, more tunnel-focused, exactly what we don't want. So, but if you expose people to a threat and show them an effective response they can make, then people are likely to want to respond and to be motivated to respond. So our challenge is not just to be hard to foster doom and gloom, but as Howard just did, point to positive possibilities. So that's the second principle. A third principle is to really recognize the state of our minds, and to recognize that our usual state of mind is dysfunctional and delusional and addictive. Our usual mind state is dysfunctional, deluded, and addictive. That is not novel news. That is the central teaching of the world's contemplative traditions. The Buddha, Howard's a disciple of the Buddha. The Buddha said, first noble truth, there is suffering in life. Second noble truth, the cause of suffering is craving, addiction. Okay? And the way out of suffering is to alleviate the addiction. So the idea that our usual mind state is way suboptimal is not new. What now we can recognize is that what we call normality is actually an unrecognized collective state of developmental arrest. That is, we are only tapping a fraction of our maturational potentials and our capacities, specific capacities. And as Howard said, psychedelics are one way of giving us a taste, not necessarily stabilizing, but giving us a taste of some of those possibilities. So third principle, the mind is, usual mind state is dysfunctional, delusional, and addictive. Fifth mind state, others are just as deluded as we are. And if we understand what's going on and the state of the mind and its causes, then we can help. But really having some understanding of our own psyches and the way they are a root cause of our current nuclear crisis and other crises is what enables us to respond effectively and strategically. So the sixth principle is that healing the world calls for healing and maturing ourselves. Because if we are all lost in what is sometimes called a consensus trance, or the contemplative traditions would call it delusion, or inauthenticity, or collective addictions, then we need to work on our own psyches to begin to get free of those issues ourselves in order to become optimal instruments of service to help and heal more broadly. So that's the sixth principle. Seventh principle is that effective responses, remember this third question, what are the most effective responses we can make? Seventh principle is the effective responses are going to address both the symptoms and their underlying causes. We need, if you look at the way these problems, the nuclear problem, the ecological crisis, etc., the usual responses are military, political, and economic. And those responses are needed. And they're only putting Band-Aids on the source of the crises, the real pathologies. And we need more than Band-Aids, because even if we succeed in handling this crisis for a while, our pathology will create more, just as it has throughout history. So we are called to respond at two levels, to address the global crises and to address the collective psychological dysfunctions that underlie and cause them. Now, what that means is we have now, just by a simple logic, we've come to realize that effective responses require knowing something about the mess, the crisis, the nuclear crisis, but also learning about our own psyches and the dysfunctions which are creating it, and learning about our own minds and beginning to heal those. And so we are called to this twofold healing. And we've rediscovered for ourselves the Buddhist Bodhisattva aspiration. The Buddhist Bodhisattva aspiration is to commit one's life to reducing suffering and enhancing well-being for all, and realizing that to do that at the root cause, in the most fundamental way, calls for growing and awakening ourselves in order to help mature and awaken others. That's the Bodhisattva aspiration. And that is effectively what we're called to, not as some great transcendental ideal, but just as a simple logic. If you're following this through, it's like, oh, that's what they're talking about. Wow, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. And we are called then to serve in a particular way. We're called to adopt what is traditionally called sacred service, and sacred service is healing and awakening both the world and its underlying causes and ourselves simultaneously. And this is, it's a lot. We're being asked to, if we want to be engaged here, we're being asked not only to try and just handle the crises, we're being asked to work on ourselves and awaken ourselves to whatever extent we can. And that's, if you hadn't figured it out, that's a lot. So it would be really nice if there were some way of combining them. And fortunately there is. There's a millennia-old tradition from India of karma yoga. Karma yoga is the use of our work and activity in the world as a spiritual and contemplative practice. So with karma yoga or sacred service, we, to simplify it dramatically, we can bring it down to 3 core practices. One is, before beginning any challenge, any task, we turn it over to a source larger than ourselves. We do it for something greater than our little egos, which both undercuts our egos and purifies the motivation. We do our work as impeccably as we possibly can, which again hones us as instruments of service and cuts away any greed or addiction or neuroses. And third, and here's the real knife edge of karma yoga, we act as impeccably as we can for the welfare and awakening of all and the reduction of nuclear war and starvation, etc. And we release attachment to the outcome. That is, we work as impeccably as we can for the highest ideal we can while releasing our little egocentric ideas of how it should turn out. And that really rips away craving, addiction. It's a really powerful practice for working with addiction. So at that point, if you really take this through deeply, then sacred service, our work on the nuclear issue, our work on the other global crises, on the meta crisis, it becomes a sacred service which culminates ideally in a growing maturation and awakening of both ourselves and, to whatever extent possible, the collective. And so we go, and one begins to realize that if one does these practices, one begins to recognize the great discovery of life is who we really are. And we make the recognition that we've been living our entire lives suffering from a case of mistaken identity, in which we think you are these little egos, these skin-encapsulated selves, rather than unbounded, vast awareness consciousness, which many of us have tasted in psychedelics and through contemplative practice. But that's where these lead us. And once we have a taste of that, we recognize that what could we want to do, what else could we want to do than reduce suffering and enhance the well-being of all, given who we are and given who others are? What else could we want to do with our lives? So now, as we increasingly recognize who we really are and our oneness with the universe, our sacred service becomes the universe acting through this body-mind. And so we go into ourselves to go out into the world more effectively, and we go out into the world to go deeper into ourselves. And we keep doing that until we recognize that the universe is just acting through us. And inner and outer have dissolved. And there's just us here now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. I feel like I've gotten some kind of grounding, that I didn't have. Thank you. So we have some time to participate as a group, and we have a little microphone, and I would just take a moment, and there's a lot of wisdom that you all have, and I'm wondering if someone might want to share some of that and take the microphone.
Yes, please.
Now, let's see. Testing? No.
Yeah, I think so.
It works? Yes. Working. Okay. Okay.
Maybe you could
You
take the mic, because there's an online audience as well.
Yeah. And then after he'll go, and then you, Luke, you go. Yeah.
Hi, John Mendelson here. I just wanted to learn a little more about what happened at the Nagasaki meeting, and what the people were talking about, how to move forward. PSR, Physicians was supposed to be a great group. Helen Caldicott's dead now, but a great group, probably. And I do think the risk of nuclear war is there, probably mostly now for global cooling. Will be probably the first use of weapons, but the put in the atmosphere to make clouds, basically. At any rate, what happened at the meeting in Nagasaki? What were people talking about? And I think that would be a great bit of information to share.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So there were several hundred physicians and healthcare workers, mostly physicians, but some nurses and psychologists, and they were from many countries, ranging from Japan was the largest delegation. Germany physicians had the second largest, but there were physicians from other European countries, from Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, Africa, and of note, there were 3 Russian physicians. Now, the Russian physicians were part of the founding of the group, but after the Ukraine war, the previous conference, these conferences happen not every year, but every 2-3 years, they were not involved, although a lifeline was kept up with one of the Russian physicians. But there was a stronger delegation of Russian physicians. There was almost a delegate from China. China has not been active in the group, with the exception of 1 year where the meeting happened in China. So there was a close, but at the last minute, it was actually the Japanese. There was a failure to get a visa through the Japanese process, but China was ready to send a top-level scientist who was actually a scientist in biological warfare, but kind of dual purpose to represent. So they made a statement, and and I'll just say this, what inspired me there was this Habakasha, which is the survivor of the atomic bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He was an 80-year-old physicist, and his group, his organization, had received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2024, and the name of the group is Nihon Hidakusha, and they've been working for decades, But what touched me the most was his description of the years after the atomic bombing, when there was so much suffering, in the areas but they were not allowed to talk about it. The reigning powers that be forbade people to talk, that there was an atomic bomb. So in a way, it reflects a little bit like most of our contemporaries, including us, we don't want to talk about it, And I mean, nobody's forcing us not to talk about it, but there's kind of a collective sort of pressure not to talk about it. And if you do start talking to people who are not tuned in, you will find that you can only say so much, and then people need to back off. And so there's a process of, just like the Habakasha, we need to overcome this pressure of not to talk about it. So Luke, you want to, yeah. And this is Luke Pustajovsky, a leader in the psychedelic emerging area, So.
And also, after reading Roger's book, the Psychology of Survival, Robbie and I were in the Good Earth grocery store in Mill Valley, and we were stalking him close to the burrito area, and just in part because you've talked about the meta crisis, but that the ideas in that book really extend to climate resilience. They very much extend to AI safety. They very much extend to pandemic preparedness and a whole host of the sort of so-called hyper objects. And it's, I just want to say, I don't know if you have any more books, or if you're going to republish that book, but it's so relevant right now. But that's not my question. My question is about having two physicians and especially addiction specialists that worked on Suboxone. When we think about the psychopharmacology of kind of spiritual evolution, and it's never sort of put in that frame necessarily. But if we think about, just for instance, you mentioned alcoholism. If you were to think about naltrexone or disulfiram or acamprosate or something like this, right? As a treatment for alcoholism, and then you think about the two MAPS trials or Lykos trials around MDMA-assisted therapy, and what looks like really, really good results for entactogens for reducing problematic drinking, with a kind of mechanism of action that maybe is part neuroplasticity, and maybe it's part a sort of antidepressant effect. But perhaps most important, maybe there's a kind of re-narrativization happening where people are telling more charitable, more self-accepting, more loving stories to themselves about themselves, and being able to look at the darkness. And so I was very interested if there are, you've mentioned psychedelics and you've mentioned LSD, and of course we know with MDMA there seems to be characteristics of reducing avoidance and reducing neuroticism and reducing self-defensiveness and allowing people to look at difficult, dense, dark material, but in a way that's not immobilizing, which doesn't give into feelings of disaffection or psychological numbing. And this is one of those, and Roger made this point, you have to be able to look at it, but you can't be immobilized by it. And so I'm interested if you have any particular ideas about psychopharmacological interventions with something that is so dense and difficult and dark. We invited like 30 people to this talk, and we got a couple takers, but Friday night for a nuclear talk, you almost need to give them MDMA to get them to come. So I'm wondering if you might speak to any of that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Well, I'm thinking that one of the things the psychedelic phenomena is helping create, and Roger has, I think, studied this more than me, is that it's also uniting us with very indigenous and ancient cultures and traditions that Western culture has become estranged from. And in fact, in the Cybernetics of Self, the essay that Bateson wrote, he implied that most of the world's traditions didn't program their people to feel so isolated, and that those of us who stay out of addiction have done that because we've been able to not listen to one of the main melodies coming to us, but we've stayed true to the more ancient tradition of society being interconnected, people being interconnected, people being interdependent. There being cybernetic feedback loops that work. And then when the alcoholic hits bottom, or the addicted person hits bottom, there is that moment of potential shift of epistemology. And of course, psychedelics can create those moments of transformation more readily, at times, and then of course it can lead to overuse of that tool, just like a classic addictive drug, or those tools can become tools of control and power, and by forces that are not attuned to the cybernetic beauty of interconnectedness. So, but I think Sasha Shulgin, who was involved in MDMA in many ways, he gave a talk at UC Santa Barbara in around 1983, apparently, and that talk is sort of called "Why I Do What I Do," and there's a transcript of it and tapes of it, and he talked about sort of a death instinct and a life instinct in human history, and it goes back as far as the Dark Ages and then the rise of alchemy, So he liked that, but then he also said, in December of 1942, the atomic chain reaction was discovered at the University of Chicago, but in April of 1943, Hoffman discovered the effects of LSD, so that he viewed that as Thanatos, the potential for Thanatos, and then the potential for Eros. And then he, at some point, dedicated his life, figured he would be that little rudder and invent more of these things, so that humanity could have those tools. So, Roger, how would you look at that question?
Yeah, thank you. I guess kind of taking off on what you asked in your comment, and the lack of getting in touch with the indigenous wisdom. If the anthropologist Bourgeonon did a survey across the world's cultures and found that 90% of cultures had institutionalized ways of inducing altered states. And if you look across cultures, then you can find two major divisions. There are monophasic cultures which draw their understanding of reality and the world and ourselves from one state, that is the usual, predominantly from one state, the usual waking state. And then there are polyphasic cultures, which are 90% of the world's cultures, which draw their understanding of ourselves and reality and relationships, etc., from multiple states, be they dreams, solitude, wilderness, ascetic practices, psychedelics, drumming, music. And it's interesting that the major example of a monophasic culture is the contemporary West. We're a minority culture in that we've divorced ourselves from these varieties of access to wisdom. And we're only just now, we're actually effectively in a transition from a monophasic to a polyphasic culture, as first psychedelics, but then contemplative practices, etc., have come into, if not dominance, at least into more widespread use. So, yeah, I think it's a very important issue.
Hi. So I've been, there's a few specters have been floating around my head during this talk, and one of which is like, the origins of the internet as like a military technology with DARPA. The other being, the kind of mirroring of like the current AI arms race to like the nuclear arms race of the Cold War, and then also like this kind of dual use of nuclear technology as like nuclear power, as like an actually like green energy source. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like with those three kind of disagreeing with each other, I'm wondering like at what point like this, like I guess I'm wondering about the limits of this like addiction model as it relates to nuclear war or just more broadly like military escalation. Like at what point do you distinguish between like military technology from technological progress more broadly? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and which I'm going to defer to other people mostly, but I will say that in the AI situation, one of the activities of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War is to study AI, and Geoffrey Hinton, the so-called godfather of AI, recently took part in a discussion about AI and control of nuclear weapons, and 4 different Nobel Peace Prize winning organizations participated. And so the uncertainty of AI might again awaken us, even though it looks like it's steamrolling us right now. But it can also awaken us. Is what is one response I have to your question.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that all technologies have not just dual use, but multiple uses. And their uses are, once again, reflections of our individual and collective psychologies. So the analogy with the nuclear issue is very striking. And the tragedy is that as technology is multiplying, is advancing exponentially. Human psychological maturation is advancing linearly and slowly at best. And we need to shift that balance. So I think it's very important. And as for the addiction model, it's a crucial window, and skillful use will use multiple models. Howard's bringing in a model which hasn't been applied, and it's very useful. And no model is the final answer. We're going to need everything, every model, every approach, every perspective, and every idea we can bring to bear to foster our collective survival and well-being.
One of the things that Bateson talks about is those of us who've treated or not treated and just experienced an alcoholic binge, there's a phenomenon in an alcoholic binge where the alcoholic is actually very, very carefully, slowly increasing the blood alcohol level over a matter of hours and even days, and very skillfully doing it to just maintain that escalation, because that's part of an addiction to the escalation. And then, of course, as Bateson say, they end up at 4 a.m. in the gutter, But in a way, when we think of GNP, maybe when we think of internet, connectivity, there is that escalation going on. But I'd love to hear from someone else to help answer your question about the military and the birth of the internet and what it all means and how it fits, into. I'd really welcome some other comments. Yeah. Pardon? Well, till about 8:30. So 10 more minutes.
So my comment is regarding the race you described between the two curves. On the one hand, you have technology that's growing exponentially, and to many of us, it feels, very uncomfortable in this acceleration. And on the other side, there is the recognition of our own limits, as a society, not as an individual, to, move on upon the linear curve. But in your mind, and you talked a lot about practice and ancient practice from traditional heritage, which is about releasing the outcome and doing ultimately the best you can at the individual level. I think a question that's on many people's mind today is, how do we help accelerate the shift at the societal level so that more people can have this? Is this a communication information problem? Is there a role for technology? Whether it is chemical technology, whether it is, AI, whether it is something else, to hasten this awakening, which otherwise threatens the survival of everyone. And I'm just wondering, perhaps in your thinking or in your book, whether you see catalyst for this acceleration to counteract this exponential curve.
I think you're raising one of the great questions of our time. How do we scale these kind of maturational and healing processes? And it's really, that question may decide our fate. How effectively we scale these, what have been historically individual practices and cultivations. How do we scale them? And are we going to need technology for that? Absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to need everything we have. So yes, how do we use technology for not only education but new kinds of education? Can AI foster be a kind of Aristotelian tutoring, for example? Or there are all sorts of possibilities, and we're going to probably need them all. Yeah, thank you.
So we'll take a couple more questions, and it's 8:30, and maybe we'll try to close about 8:45 and have a few more questions and discussion. How does that sound?
Sure.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much for this very informative and provocative talk. Since we
A little
I am,
louder.
I'm Parmeet Rad. I'm an addiction medicine physician, and correlating the topics really did resonate with me. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the approach? And of course, I know we talked about perhaps the causes and in a philosophical sense, the solutions. But I know in terms of addiction, a lot of the field is moving towards a more harm reduction approach, as opposed to you can't have that and let's deprive all of this, and it's paternalistic top down. I'm going to tell you can't have that. You can't have your job if you have, if you're doing X, Y, and Z. And in terms of cultures like Portugal that has decriminalized drugs, or other places where they have embraced more harm reduction approach to treatments, like heroin-assisted treatment, for example, they see that after a time when patients are no longer in fear of losing their job or children or housing, and have a safe place to have safety and receive treatment, the pathology gradually lessens and lessens, and then over time it leads to extinction of that behavior and healing, where the individual no longer needs to return to the clinic for 3 times a day heroin administration. So I'm just wondering, where does harm reduction fit into this picture? I know we didn't talk about solutions as much, but so just wondering what your thoughts might be on that. Thank you.
There's a quality of some addiction treatment, and sometimes the AA model sometimes was blamed, or was used as a method of over control, of people, when it really, the core of the teaching in AA doesn't have anything to do with the kind of punishment and control, that emerged as maybe a major theme in addiction treatment, which is now, as you say, transforming to this harm reduction model, which actually then also opens up a merging of the fields of addiction recovery and psychedelic healing. It creates that opportunity. So that's how I would react to your question. Yeah. John, yeah.
So I'll make a couple, maybe a different way to unify things here. One of the current theories of addiction is delayed discounting, is prioritizing immediate needs over future needs. Warren Bickel referred to that as an inability to have future episodic thinking, right? And I think actually in the nuclear, in the issues of climate change and nuclear war, it's all immediate thinking. That's the fear, right? It just switches all to like this minute you got to make a decision, and there's no prioritization for tomorrow at all, right? So I think that may be a unifying theme more than some form of spiritual malaise. On the issue of technological innovation and pace, the recent Nobel Prize in economics was awarded to an economic historian who says the pace is the same as it's always been, right? All those technologies, sailboats, plows, they're gone. They're history. They've been replaced by new technologies. They've innovated. So I don't think the dwelling on the rate or the presence of technological innovation is actually going to help us, right? Because it's going to continue. It's what humans have been doing since they first tried to go from hunter-gatherers to agrarians. So, but I do think future episodic thinking is actually what people get more of. They, again, you get that guy you're talking about drinking. He can only prioritize his next drink. He can't prioritize tomorrow morning, right? And at the company, Rea Health, 7% of patients we enroll don't make the visit on the day they enroll. Okay, they can't get to their first visit. It's amazing, after having paid for it, right? So, anyway, I think that may be a unifying theme that might actually be more with nuclear war more interesting to sort of go after and reasonable.
Thank you, John. There's another question, comment. Yeah.
Yeah, just so is there like a evolution in the thinking around addiction since sort of Bateson kind of elevated it as, oh, this is a topic that needs more attention. Because when I look at it, you think about, there's sort of like I think three dynamics that interplay. There's like a almost like permanent stress environment, which impacts the way people get stuck in patterns. And then there's trauma, like unhealed trauma, which I don't know if that's necessarily addiction, but people can get into habituated, pretty negative loops with that. And I'm curious, when I look at the current reality, to me, it was helpful to think about addiction because I hadn't really thought about it in the context of the dynamics. But I feel like there's a pretty complex play between addiction, trauma, unhealed trauma, and permanent stress, which obviously Trump's pretty good at creating. I'm just curious how you look at that. Is there an evolved way of blending these thoughts and the current thinking around addiction in the context of that?
Well, I'll say one thing, and Roger will be able to explain it more in terms of. But one of the teachings of Alcoholics Anonymous is that alcoholism is cunning, baffling, and powerful, and sometimes it's always going to be mysterious on some level. We're never going to totally understand it because it's such a fundamental part of our being. But that being said, Bateson, between 75 and 80, kept talking about addiction and this global thing. Jerry Brown picked it up a couple of years later. It hasn't really been picked up too much since then. Some of these thinkers, like someone named Robert J. Lifton, was a psychiatrist, didn't really use that word, used things like psychic numbing. Joanna Macy used the word despair, and hope. Roger mentioned addiction coming from the teachings of non-Western psychologies, But I think everybody in this society, small town, big town, left, right, Republican, Democrat, knows something about addiction and has a very deep feeling about it. So I think if we could capitalize on that concept and learn more about it, there might be a mathematical part of it with cybernetics, that technical people can look at. There might be cultural aspects we haven't looked at. So that's to my hope that, and then you combine that with all of this exploration going on and this openness to a new kind of pharmacology. I mean, look, we've been confined, despite thousands of years of tradition of using these different states of consciousness, including drug states. And then we've been confined to these very narrow classes of drugs, opiates, benzodiazepines, SSRIs, they're very limited, and they're useful. They're all useful. They're tools. But now that we have this opening of psychedelics in psychopharmacology, I mean, there's a lot of possibility. So if you combine these two, I think there's, I derive a certain amount of hope, but also for those people who are really trying to understand AI, yes, dive into it, but obviously people are going to have to look into it with more than just how can our stock grow to billions and trillions, but how can this serve humanity? Yeah.
I have something to say here. Steve, if maybe people want you to end on your note, but so I have just one thing to say. I thought maybe I could wrap it up and
Great.
And end it. This microphone here, never held a microphone, so here it's getting to my head. I just wanted to say I went to Nagasaki. I had the privilege of going to Nagasaki with Howard. It was a lot of science in the room, and I appreciated everyone, all these people from all over the world coming together to talk about this subject. And what I came away, and I'll just say the physicist that was talking to us that he was there in Nagasaki, he was actually 92. So he was 12 years old when the atomic bomb went off. He remembers this. 5 of his family members died. And it was powerful to hear his story, and Howard and I didn't happen to go out the next day we went out to see this peace park that was right there in Nagasaki. And that, I wasn't going there with any intention to understand anything, to be honest. I hate to say it, but I wasn't curious at the moment. But I went to that peace park and I was extremely moved. I felt the power, I felt the energy of the park. And I'm hearing tonight Stephen and Howard talking about addiction and also about energy. And I just want to say, I just had these thoughts that I was hopeful coming out of Nagasaki because the people there were peaceful. They wanted peace. There was peace. It was a safe place. It was people from all over the world presented statues at this park. People were honoring these statues from Japan. People were there to, understand these statues and what it meant. And I think energy is really what we have the power to. I think we're all energy, and we all have the power to send this energy of peace to the people, the few people in the world right now that have the power to destroy it. There's a few people, maybe there's more, but maybe we have the energy even in this room right now to end on a little meditation for 3 minutes or 2 minutes and just stay silent and send this energy. But also I'm thinking about, there's a lot of talk about treating addiction, and I know this is Howard's specialty and many in your room. But also we need to look at, why do we have addiction? And it's all related to trauma. And it's some type of trauma, that's people are trying to escape or run away to some other feelings. So, the future is let's prevent addiction too. But the trauma, and let's just use our energy and our space right now, like maybe 2 minutes, and I'll time us. We can close our eyes and really end on a note of hope and what we really want in the world, peace. Okay, so we'll just begin and just close our eyes and really send that energy to the people that are, we don't know what they're thinking, but we're going to send positive peace. Thank you, everybody. I felt your energy, and I know it's getting out there.
Thank you all very much for your concern about these issues, and Howard, thank you for your work and bringing us all together.
Yeah, thank you for joining me in such a wonderful way. Yeah.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate your work. Doing good stuff. Thank you.
And I've heard about this. I'm glad.
It's very good. Yeah, they got to run,
Yeah.
but
Oh, yeah, Mike.
yeah. Okay, how about you? Yeah, no, it's very good. I have some thoughts about it.
Yeah, so we'll have a good follow.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Great. Yeah, you're doing okay.
Yeah, hanging in there. How
Okay.
about you?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's good. It's really good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you know, Bateson started for me when we were on that trip where we survived. Where
Oh,
did
right,
did
right,
100
Colorado,
people, did 100
right.
people,
People
die or
died.
something? We just
What was the name of that? It was
the Thompson Canyon.
Thompson
or
Canyon. Yeah,
We
Thompson
walked
Canyon.
through there, and then we were at night, and you were telling me about form, substance, and difference. You were reading. it.
Yeah. You know what's funny, sort of? Bateson's thing on alcoholism was one of his less compelling writings. I like, you know,
Yeah.
his general. I didn't think he quite got it with that, but, you know, there's something that, you know, it's a multi-level thing, you know, person, family, neighborhood, you know, state, you know, country, culture, crazy, you know, crazy Putin, you know, you have to deal with psychopathic leaders, and it's an arms race, you know, where you know, Putin does this, we have to do, you know, and it is like an addiction, but it's hard, you know, when you're speaking multi-level, you know, addiction at the personal level has to do with biopsychosocial thing. You know, on the higher level, it may not be the same thing. You know, you're using a metaphor for addiction.
Yeah.
You know, for that. So, but you could go down and say, okay, if everybody gets enlightened, and if you look at addiction as, you know, Buddhist craving and stuff, everybody could deal with that, then somehow the enlightenment could emanate up the layers to create, you know, crazy rulers or something.
Have you worked on that essay? You sent me an essay about.
Yeah,
Are you working on it still?
I haven't for a while, but yeah.
Yeah, because I really enjoyed that.
Did you like it?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and so
Because I think it did really explain the mind-body thing, you know, but yeah, I was working on something on consciousness too, but I didn't get anywhere. I mean, I couldn't, you know, what I'm thinking of doing now, I have this weird reaction, I don't know if when people are angry, but they're suppressing their anger, I tend to yawn.
Yawn, yeah.
Yeah, so I have this, you know, and I'll be like, somebody will be talking about something that would never, go ahead, yes.
No, do you remember Mike Schwab? We visited them in Lafayette a long time ago when the kids were really little.
Yeah.
Mike and I went to that station.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I don't want to
Right.
interrupt.
No, yeah.
But anyhow, so like I could talk to somebody, and I had like one person who was talking about, how devastating it was, the loss of her brother, and they all went to the funeral, and how beautiful it was that her daughter was singing, at the funeral, and so I was running like crazy. It was over the phone. So I said, Barbara, I'm picking up anger, like this is sort of crazy right here. And she would say things like, oh my God, my brother was so horrible. I had to, watch him my entire life. And, but this crazy yawning, picks that shit up that you would never, get from. So what I realized was that in the, I thought it was facial expressions and voice tones, but over the pandemic, I did a lot of phone sessions. So it happens over the phone. So that means it's totally
Yeah.
voice tones.
Yeah.